She said she needed attention, but I never imagined she'd look for it somewhere else. The first time I noticed her, she wasn't doing anything remarkable, at least, not to anyone else. She stood at the edge of the room, a quiet observer, a cup of coffee held delicately between her hands. But to me, she was magnetic in a way I couldn't yet name. There was something in the subtle tilt of her head, the way her eyes scanned the room with careful attention, that made it impossible to look away. She was confident, undeniably so, yet there was a vulnerability in her expression, a flicker of something unspoken, as if she carried a weight she didn't share with the world. I remember feeling a pang of curiosity, an almost electric awareness of her presence. I noticed how her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic cup, a soft rhythm that seemed almost like a secret language. The sound was so ordinary, yet in that moment, it became oddly intimate. When our hands brushed while passing a stack of papers, I felt a small jolt of warmth, not shocking, just enough to make me acutely aware of the space between us. There was a laugh, soft and melodic, that drifted from her lips as she spoke to someone else across the room. It wasn't boisterous or performed, it was genuine. It lingered in my ears longer than it should have, and I found myself replaying it in my mind later, the sound wrapped in the faint scent of her perfume, subtle but distinct, a mix of vanilla and something earthy, grounding yet delicate. I wanted to talk to her, to learn the story behind the quiet weight in her eyes, but hesitation held me back. There was respect woven into the fascination I felt, a quiet acknowledgement that she was more than a passing curiosity. And yet, every small gesture she made, every shift of her posture, seemed to communicate to me something unspoken. She existed fully, deeply, but on a plane I was just beginning to perceive. It wasn't just physical attraction, though I couldn't deny that her presence stirred something in me. It was more nuanced, the way she seemed aware of her own space, yet simultaneously aware of others, the balance of confidence and vulnerability that made her feel both untouchable and fragile at once. And even from afar, I found myself wanting to offer something, attention, understanding, the comfort of being seen, without knowing if I would ever have the chance. As the moment passed and our paths diverged, I caught one last glance of her. She smiled lightly, just at me, and something unspoken passed between us, a spark that neither of us acknowledged aloud. And in that brief connection, I felt the first tremor of something that would only grow more complicated with time. Curiosity that edged toward longing, and longing that was tempered with the quiet fear of getting too close too soon. From that first encounter, I knew she wasn't just another face in the room. She was someone I would notice, again and again, someone whose presence lingered like the faint echo of a favorite song. And deep down, even before a single word passed between us, I sensed that whatever this was, attraction, connection, or something more elusive, it would demand patience, observation, and a willingness to see her fully, not just what she allowed the world to see. Over the next few days, our paths seemed to cross more often than coincidence could explain. Coffee breaks, quick chats in the hallway, moments when the office felt just quiet enough that we could linger without interruption. It was in these small spaces, these ordinary intervals, that I began to notice the subtler contours of her personality, the gentle humor behind her carefully measured words, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about something she loved, and the occasional shadow that passed across her face when she spoke of her loneliness. She confided small pieces of herself to me, little cracks in the polished exterior she presented to the world. At first, it was tentative, a mention of a project she felt unsure about, a fleeting comment about missing an old friend. I listened, really listened, without offering solutions, because I understood that sometimes what she needed wasn't advice but presence. She noticed, of course. Her eyes would meet mine, and in those glances there was recognition, the subtle acknowledgement that someone was paying attention in a way that mattered. We began sharing more intentional time together. A walk around the nearby park, the city quiet in the early evening, her voice low as she recounted a memory from her past, her hand occasionally brushing against mine as if by accident. Each touch was fleeting but charged with a quiet electricity, a communication of comfort and connection that words alone could not convey. I became attuned to the nuances of her gestures, the way she twirled a lock of hair when nervous, the the slight lift of her brow when she was curious, the way she leaned into the warmth of a conversation, seeking connection without demanding it. For me, this closeness was intoxicating, though it never felt overwhelming. I noticed the softness of her voice, the careful way she measured her words, and the moments of pause that carried as much meaning as her sentences. There was a rhythm to our interactions, a give and take that felt natural, unforced. And with each shared laugh, each lingering glance, the distance that had once defined her presence began to shrink. Yet, despite the warmth growing between us, there was still a quiet hesitation in her demeanor. She was cautious, measured, protecting herself from disappointment. I sensed it in the way she occasionally recoiled from too much familiarity, the subtle guarding of her emotions behind graceful composure. And in response, I became more observant, more patient, learning to read the spaces between her words, to understand what she was saying without needing her to say it aloud. By the time our lunch ended one afternoon, and we walked together through the late afternoon sunlight, the city around us blurred into insignificance. The closeness we shared had become comfortable, natural, a quiet intimacy that felt unspoken but deeply understood. It was in these moments, when shoulders brushed, when hands almost touched, that the slow-burning tension grew into something more profound, the recognition that we were no longer just passing acquaintances, but two people quietly seeking solace and understanding in each other's presence. And even as I walked away that day, the warmth of her laughter lingering in my ears, I knew this connection was only beginning, that our bond, fragile and tentative, had the potential to deepen into something neither of us could ignore. The closeness we had begun to cultivate was delicate, like sunlight filtering through thin curtains, soft, comforting, yet easily disturbed. It was during one ordinary afternoon, amidst the hum of our usual routines, that I first felt the faint ripple of unease. She laughed a little too freely at a comment from someone else, her gaze lingering longer than necessary, the warmth in her smile directed elsewhere. A subtle pang hit me in the chest, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniable. It wasn't jealousy in the reckless sense. It was the quiet recognition that the bond one had started to cherish was not as singular in her world as it had been in my imagination. I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps I was reading too much into a casual interaction, a social habit she didn't even realize she was projecting. But small patterns began to emerge. A lingering message on her phone that she answered with barely concealed delight. A fleeting glance shared with someone I didn't know, the soft curve of her lips that sometimes sought attention I couldn't provide in that moment. Each incident was fleeting, almost trivial, yet it left a subtle residue of discomfort in my mind. I began to observe her more closely, not in suspicion, but in quiet, cautious curiosity. I noticed how her hand moved to tuck her hair behind her ear when someone complimented her, how she seemed to almost glow under attention, and how she sometimes seemed momentarily distant, her thoughts elsewhere. She hadn't said a word about dissatisfaction, yet the weight of unspoken longing hung between us. I wrestled with my own feelings in silence. Do I confront her? Do I speak up and risk shattering the fragile closeness we've built? Or do I stay silent, hoping this phase will pass, that the bond we've formed will survive the small tremors of her divided attention? The hesitation was a new sensation, a delicate balance between hurt and understanding, between the desire to be close and the fear of pushing too hard. Despite the uncertainty, I could still feel the threads of connection. When we walked together, her hand would brush mine, her laughter would float across the room, her eyes would occasionally find mine with that familiar spark of recognition. It was both reassuring and confusing, proof of our bond, yet a reminder that it wasn't exclusive. That evening, I found myself replaying moments in my mind, the warmth of her shoulder when she laughed, the fleeting touch of her hand against mine, the way she leaned slightly toward me during conversation. Each memory was tinged with longing and the quiet ache of noticing her attention slipping elsewhere. I realized that the attraction and affection I felt weren't just about physical closeness. They were about the trust and emotional intimacy we had started to build. And yet, that very intimacy made the thought of her seeking connection elsewhere sting more sharply than I had expected. I didn't say anything that day. I waited, letting the tension simmer quietly, aware that the real challenge wasn't just noticing her actions, it was understanding why she sought attention elsewhere, and whether I could bridge the growing gap without breaking the fragile bond we had nurtured. The slow burn romance, once simple and comforting, was now tinged with complexity, a delicate test of patience, empathy, and the courage to face unspoken truths. The evening air felt heavier than usual, as if the world itself had sensed the tension that had quietly grown between us. I had rehearsed the words countless times in my mind, each iteration slightly different, yet none capturing the exact weight of what I wanted to convey. I didn't want to accuse her, never that, but I needed to understand. We were sitting across from each other in the soft glow of a cafe, the usual background chatter fading into insignificance. My fingers traced the rim of my cup, almost as if the tactile sensation could anchor my thoughts. "So, you went somewhere else for attention?" I asked, my voice low, careful, leaving space for her to respond without pressure. The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected, carrying the sting of disappointment and the fragile hope of understanding. She froze, her eyes widening slightly, as though she hadn't expected me to notice, or perhaps hadn't expected me to voice it. For a moment, silence stretched between us, taut and fragile. Then, slowly, she looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve, betraying a vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. I needed attention," she said softly, almost a whisper, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I watched her, noticing the subtle details, the way her shoulders slumped, the slight quiver in her hands, the way her eyes darted away and then back at mine, searching for understanding. I felt the ache in my chest, the tension of hurt and empathy colliding. She wasn't trying to be cruel, she was human, flawed and longing, and that longing had led her elsewhere. I reached out slowly, my hand hovering near hers, not imposing, just offering the possibility of connection. She didn't pull away, she let her fingers brush against mine, the contact light but grounding. It was a gesture that said more than words could, a silent acknowledgement of regret, of trust, of something that still lingered between us despite the hurt. We talked quietly after that, each sentence careful, deliberate. I asked questions, not to accuse, but to understand her emotions, her needs. She spoke honestly, revealing the loneliness that had driven her, the yearning for recognition that she hadn't realized was as vital to her as air. I listened, really listened, without judgment, and in doing so, something shifted. The confrontation wasn't about blame, it was about honesty, about letting each other see the parts of ourselves we usually hide. The cafe around us blurred into insignificance. The warmth of the evening, the muted golden light, the soft hum of conversation around us, none of it mattered. What mattered was the fragile bridge of understanding that we began to rebuild, the slow reclamation of trust, the subtle intimacy of shared vulnerability. By the time we left, walking side by side under the streetlights, the tension hadn't entirely vanished, but it had transformed. What had been hurt and suspicion was now tempered by clarity and empathy. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, our hands almost touching, a quiet reminder that connection wasn't about perfection, it was about presence, patience, and the courage to face discomfort together. And in that moment, I realized that confronting the truth, speaking it aloud, hearing it, feeling it, had not destroyed what we were building. It had, in fact, made it more real, more tangible, and infinitely more human. After the confrontation, a quiet tension lingered between us, not the sharp sting of conflict, but something softer, like the echo of waves after a storm. We had laid our emotions bare, exposed the small fissures that had begun to form between us, and yet, in doing so, we had created a space for honesty that hadn't existed before. It was in this new space that our connection deepened, a slow, deliberate weaving of trust and understanding. We found ourselves spending more intentional moments together. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting side by side on the worn leather sofa in her living room, the evening light spilling through the curtains, painting everything in soft gold. She would lean slightly into my shoulder, not fully, just enough that our closeness felt natural and unforced. Her hair would brush against my arm, a subtle reminder of her presence, and I found comfort in the weight of those tiny touches. There was no rush, no expectation, just two people quietly discovering each other's rhythms and vulnerabilities. She spoke of her past in ways she hadn't before, revealing the quiet loneliness that had driven her to seek attention elsewhere. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew steadier as I listened, truly listened, without judgment or interruption. I could feel the tension in her body ease slightly with every word, a gradual release that seemed to say, "I can trust you." It was in these moments, observing the vulnerability she allowed herself to share, that I felt a profound tenderness toward her, not just for the person she presented to the world, but for the layers beneath it. Our conversations extended into the subtle realm of touch and presence. A hand resting lightly on hers as we discussed a memory, shoulders brushing when we reached for the same object, the quiet warmth of proximity during a shared laugh. Each gesture, though small, carried weight. They were signs of rebuilding, of connection, of a mutual desire to be close while respecting the fragile emotional space we both occupied. Internally, I wrestled with the lingering ache of past disappointment, and the cautious hope that this bond could endure. I reflected on my own emotions, recognizing that my care for her went beyond surface attraction. It was rooted in admiration, empathy, and a desire to be the person who could meet her emotionally without overwhelming her. In turn, she seemed to recognize this as well, her eyes lingering on mine during quiet moments, a soft smile hinting at gratitude and trust. Even ordinary moments became charged with significance. Sharing a cup of tea, walking in the park as sunlight dappled through the leaves, exchanging glances that spoke volumes, each act reinforced the bridge we were rebuilding. It was a slow, careful process, a dance of vulnerability and understanding, each step a testament to patience and mutual respect. By the end of these reflective days, I realized that emotional intimacy had taken the lead over tension or doubt. The confrontation had not fractured us, it had opened a door, and through it, we were learning to navigate the delicate landscape of trust, care, and affection. It was here, in the quiet acknowledgement of each other's humanity and needs, that the slow-burning romance began to feel inevitable, a connection strengthened not by perfection, but by the courage to be seen, fully, flaws and all. In the days that followed our honest confrontation, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere between us, a quiet, almost imperceptible change that spoke volumes. What had once been tentative glances and polite conversation had begun to transform into a rhythm of intentional closeness, gestures that conveyed care without the need for words. Each small act was a building block in the fragile structure of trust we were slowly reconstructing. It started with the simplest things. She would linger a moment longer when handing me a document, her fingers brushing mine by accident, or so she said. I would notice the way her laughter softened when I teased her gently, the ease with which she allowed herself to smile in my presence without the shadow of defensiveness. These moments, small and fleeting, became profoundly significant. They were proof that we could navigate the delicate balance between vulnerability and safety, between connection and respect. We began to share intentional acts of care. On one evening, I brought her favorite tea, the scent of chamomile filling the air between us. She accepted it with a soft smile, and for a brief moment, our hands touched as she took the cup. The contact was fleeting, but it carried warmth, an acknowledgement of presence, of attentiveness, of understanding. She responded in kind, noticing little details about me, a lingering glance when I seemed tired, a question about my day that revealed genuine curiosity, a soft touch on the shoulder when she sensed my hesitation. Physical closeness remained subtle but meaningful. Sitting together on the couch, our shoulders would occasionally brush. Walking side by side, our hands would almost touch, fingers grazing in moments that felt charged with intimacy yet completely innocent. Every touch, every glance, was carefully calibrated, an unspoken communication that said, "I'm here. I see you. You matter to me." Laughter returned to our interactions, lighter now, more effortless. We joked about trivial things, shared small victories, and even discussed past mistakes with a newfound openness. These conversations weren't just casual, they were the scaffolding of trust, allowing us to explore our emotional connection without fear of judgment. Each moment reinforced the understanding that we were both willing to invest in this delicate bond, to be present for one another without rushing, without forcing intimacy beyond what felt safe. I began to recognize a pattern in her behavior that filled me with cautious hope. The way she sought proximity, the subtle attention she paid to my moods, the little touches that were no longer accidental. And in response, I found myself reciprocating, holding her hand lightly when comforting her, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder, sharing glances that lingered just long enough to communicate understanding without words. By the end of this period, I realized that the slow process of rebuilding trust had deepened our connection in a way that passion alone never could. We had navigated conflict, confronted vulnerability, and now existed in a space of mutual respect and tender attentiveness. The romance that had begun as curiosity and subtle attraction had evolved into something more profound, a slow, deliberate intimacy grounded in care, empathy, and a willingness to show up fully for one another. By the time we reached this quiet moment in our journey, the tension that had once hovered between us had softened into something far more delicate, yet far more profound. It wasn't the absence of conflict that defined our closeness now, but the understanding that we had navigated it together, the courage to speak, the patience to listen, and the willingness to remain vulnerable even when it was uncomfortable. The slow burn of our connection had matured into an intimacy that needed no grand gestures. It existed in the small, meaningful moments that only we could share. We found ourselves walking through a park bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight. The warmth on our skin mirrored the quiet comfort we felt in each other's presence. Her hand hovered near mine, almost touching, as if testing the boundaries of trust one delicate step at a time. I didn't rush. I let the silence between us speak, letting the gentle rhythm of our steps carry the unspoken words, "I'm here. I'm still here. I care." Finally, she looked up at me, eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude, vulnerability, and something I had been quietly hoping for, a willingness to let me in completely. "I needed attention," she said again, softly, almost as if reminding herself as much as me. "But I see now, you've been here all along. I just didn't notice it in time." Her voice trembled slightly, the raw honesty pulling at something deep inside me. I reached out slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, letting my fingers linger for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "I'm here now," I said quietly but with conviction. "And I want to be here. Not because I noticed you looking elsewhere, but because I see you." The words were simple, yet charged with the gravity of our shared experiences. The weight of past misunderstandings and fleeting insecurities lifted slightly, replaced by a tentative but unwavering connection. We sat together on a nearby bench, shoulders brushing, the world around us fading into a soft blur. In that quiet intimacy, there was laughter again, lighter, freer, and infused with the depth of understanding we had built. We spoke of hopes, of small dreams, of things we hadn't shared with anyone else. Each word, each glance, each accidental touch reinforced a new truth. We were committed to being present for one another, not in a frantic rush, but in the deliberate, careful way that relationships built on trust and patience thrive. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Our closeness, once tentative and fragile, had grown into a mutual acknowledgement of care and affection. A gentle touch of the hand, a lingering glance, a soft smile, these were the markers of our love, of the bond we had nurtured through vulnerability and understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of amber and rose, we walked back together, hands brushing, eventually finding the courage to interlace them. It was a quiet affirmation, a shared promise that neither of us needed to speak aloud. The journey hadn't been perfect, and we both carried our moments of doubt, but in the end, we had found each other, not as flawless beings, but as people willing to see, understand, and care deeply for one another. And in that shared silence, that gentle touch, that quiet understanding, I realized that the slow burn had reached its natural, perfect conclusion. Two hearts fully present, fully aware, and fully willing to move forward together.